Good afternoon. My name is Bob Bylone. I am the Executive Director of the Pennsylvania Recycling Market Center and also a National Recycling Coalition Board Director. Today, we are beginning again the National Recycling Coalition quarterly markets development meetings. This is and will provide a virtual networking opportunity ongoing and on a quarterly basis. So please look for future advertisements. These quarterly market development meetings may take the form of a webinar, open dialogue and networking on facilitated topics, and certainly current recycling markets development concerns. To that end, today's webinar will provide an overview of China's National Sword Initiative. Our presenter today is Robin Wiener, who I will introduce in a moment. Following the presentation, we will conduct a question and answer session. If you have a question or comment, please use the GoToWebinar dialog box located in the control panel on your screen. You may also use the dialog box to request assistance if you are experiencing difficulties during the webinar. Please note that the webinar will be made available for viewing via YouTube links on the National Recycling Coalition and Pennsylvania Recycling Market Center websites. The presentation of today can also be downloaded using the handout upload feature on your webinar control panel. Now I would like to introduce our presenter, Robin Wiener. In addition to her position as a National Recycling Coalition Board Director, for over 20 years, Robin has led the Washington, D.C. based Institute of Scrap Recycling Industries, or ISRI, representing more than 1,700 private, for-profit companies nationwide and throughout the globe that process, broker, and industrially consume scrap commodities, including scrap metal, paper, plastics, textiles, rubber, and electronics. ISRI provides advocacy, education and training, safety outreach, compliance assistance, quality, environmental health and safety certification, and more for the $100 billion industry, while also promoting public awareness of the vital role recycling plays in the U.S. economy, global trade, the environment, and through sustainable development. ISRI has annual revenues in excess of $16 million and employs a staff of approximately 45. For additional information on ISRI, please visit www.isri.org. Robin's academic background impressively also includes both degrees in chemical engineering and law from the University of Pennsylvania and Georgetown University. It is with great pride that I introduce Robin Wiener, and I turn today's webinar over to her for our remarks. Robin?
Thank you, Bob. And I want to thank you for the opportunity to talk with everyone about what is happening in China. Because if you think about what's affecting the markets these days, not only here in the US, but globally, certainly China, which has always had a large impact, is certainly having its largest impact in a long time. So we thought in talking among the board members of NRC that to kick off the market development series, the topic of China would be a great start for the series. And what we're hoping to do today, or what I'm hoping to do, is really provide the framework for why this is happening, what's happening, why it's happening, the context, why it's having an impact. And then I would envision that there'll be future conversations throughout the year as to how we cope with these challenges and developments that are occurring. So again, what we're trying to do here is really set the stage for what's happening. So with that, I was going to give a quick background on ISRI, but Bob's already done a great job on that. So thank you, Bob. I'll then give a little bit of a snapshot of the recycling industry in the U.S., of which obviously a lot of folks on this call are part of, but also how it fits into the global market. and then talk about the current environmental challenges in China, which have led to what we're seeing in terms of an evolving set of regulations and policies affecting the recycling industry globally. And then looking ahead, what are those challenges? What are we doing currently to try to deal with them? What can we all do together? And again, it's all evolving. It's all changing as we speak. As a matter of fact, I'm going to be in Beijing next month, right after our convention for about a week, meeting with both Chinese and U.S. authorities, and I expect we'll learn a lot more then, and I'll be a lot smarter when I come back than I am now. There's obviously also, not obviously, but there's a lot of reorganization happening within the Chinese government in terms of who's even responsible for these regulations, and that's going to have an impact down the road. So again, it's all changing on a regular basis, and so we'll need to have this will have to be a continued discussion. Again, I think we've already gone through this, so I'll just skip this very quickly so we can focus on the meat of what we want to talk about. But I think it's important to look at what the scope of recycling is in the U.S. And obviously my focus here is on who we represent, which is the private industry, the private for-profit industry. We estimate, based on economic studies we do annually, that we directly employ about 155,000 people, and it affects the industry affects another 378,000 people throughout the country in terms of jobs indirectly supported through recycling. And this is, again, based on what we estimate, based on our economic impact analysis, to be $118 billion annual impact. In terms of the annual amount of scrap that's processed in the United States, and I define scrap, we use the term scrap, some people use secondary materials or recyclables. You can use any term you want as long as you don't call it waste. And when I refer to scrap, I'm talking about the range of the commodities, the ferrous and non-ferrous metals, paper, plastics, glass, textile, rubber and electronics. So it's the full scope of scrap commodities. And although there is some variation from year to year, on average, we're looking at least 130,000 tons of scrap that's processed annually in the United States. And what we've got there on the screen is a breakdown by commodity. And in the upper right, where you see that the rectangle with the globe and the 2017 on it, that's our annual yearbook, a snapshot of the front cover. We have a lot of data in there. We publish that every year. It's got data on flows in the U.S. and outside, as well as a lot of information about how material is processed and by commodity. And that is available free on our website. Please feel free to download that if you want a copy. If you have any problems locating it, let me know. And if there's any additional data you'd like to see developed that isn't there, let us know that as well. Now, what's very important to understand about the recycling infrastructure in the U.S., and not just the private industry, but recycling in general and the flow of the commodity in the U.S., is that in any given year, if you look at the last 20 plus years here in the United States, between 30 and 40% of what we process in the U.S., what we collect and then process, so not just collect, but process in the U.S., is actually destined for the export market. And it's destined for steel mills, foundries, paper mills, plastic refiners, etc., in more than 150 different countries around the world. When I look at the stats for the last 5 to 10 years in particular, there's no year that we shipped to fewer than 150 different countries. Most recently it was 155. The value in 2017 of those export commodities was close to $18 billion. And that represented 37 million metric tons. And I shared that what's also important to note is in the previous screen, I shared the number of employees in the industry that are directly employed by the industry, and that's 155,000. Our studies and analysis indicate that a third of those employees, their jobs are directly related to this aspect of the industry, the export market. So again, you can imagine that any impact on shipments of this material outside the U.S. are going to flow and have an impact, a negative impact potentially throughout the entire recycling infrastructure because of these numbers. We are also, the U.S. is the largest exporter of scrap throughout the world. And there's a number here, it quotes that there's 160 million tons of scrap that's exported globally from countries around the world. Actually, that's an outdated number. You'll see later I quote 180 million tons. So it's worth more than $70 billion. So it's not just the U.S. that's interested in this issue. We're working with partners, my counterparts in countries around the world dealing with this issue, not just the issue in China, but any issues that affect access to markets for recyclables. What's also important to understand, and again, I know that in many ways I'm talking to people who already know this information, so I apologize, but what's important to the success of the industry and of recycling generally is not just the volumes. I'm talking in terms of volumes here, but these volumes are reflective of quality materials. So I'm sure that there's a greater volume that is available to go into the market, but it's not of sufficient quality. All these materials that ship are shipped according to specification grades that are set between buyers and sellers. ISRI maintains a specifications guide that's used globally. It's used domestically, but also globally, and it's based on effectively tolerances and minimum max contamination thresholds for the various grades of material that the manufacturers will take, because this is all material, it's specification grade material that's feeding directly into manufacturing. I'll jump next to the next slide, which shows actually, and I apologize, it's very small print, but what this is meant to show is where exports go from the U.S. And it's showing the major markets over the last 7 years or so. And you can see that China certainly is the largest. That's the dark blue on the top. China, last year, we shipped $5.6 billion worth of scrap to China. So while we do ship to 150 to 155 different countries around the world, the reality is that China has an outsized share of that market. Last year, it represented 31% of the market on a dollar basis. There have been years it's as high as 40 or 50% averaged across the commodities. The next largest market is actually just our neighbor to the north, Canada, taking about 12% of scrap, and then 6% each to Mexico, our neighbor to the south, and Turkey, and then India is the next major market at 5% share. As I mentioned, it is a global market for scrap, and the total consumption of, again, secondary materials, recyclables, scrap, whatever you want to call it, is about 800 million metric tons. And our counterpart in Brussels, the BIR, the Bureau of International Recycling, has done some studies and have shown that 40% on average of manufacturing input, so raw material feedstock, is actually scrapped into manufacturing globally. So it's, again, one of our main messages and one of the main issues we advocate for here in Washington, and the message we try to send globally, is that this is not waste material. This is a manufacturing feedstock. And I think that's probably one of the biggest challenges we face in recycling, is making people understand the difference between what is legitimately waste that's going to disposal and what may look dirty, but it's truly very valuable material that is processed according to specification grade and feeds into manufacturing industry. Okay, so let's shift and talk about China specifically and how China fits into this picture. One of the big reasons why China is having such a big impact is not just because it's the 31% of U.S. exports, but if you look at it by commodity, there are certain commodities where the share is more than 50%. Look at copper scrap, recovered fiber, recovered paper and fiber, and plastic scrap take more than 50% of our exports. So you can imagine anything that impacts those commodities in China is going to immediately have an impact here in the U.S. For iron and steel, ferrous scrap, it's much lower. It used to be higher, but now it's much lower. And aluminum is only about 24%. one thing that I wanted to address, and again, I know that a lot of folks here on this call know this, but I think it's important to lay this out, which is why has China taken such a large share? It's not because there's a preference for shipping one place or another. It is a free and open market. And there is an excess of scrap that's generated here in the U.S. that gives us an opportunity for an export market. But also, there's been over the last 20 years, as we all know, there's been a huge industrialization occurring in China and a huge rise in their middle class. And so the demand for material has been intense. And they're actually a natural resource poor in China. So they need the scrap to feed their manufacturing base. So the reason why this material finds its way to China is not because we're trying to get rid of it. It's not because China is being viewed as the world's garbage can. It has nothing to do with that, despite the headlines we're seeing in newspapers and in the press over the last couple of months. That's not to say there haven't been bad players that have shipped some bad stuff to China. And we obviously want to do everything we can to shut that down. And I will tell you that there's been a huge decrease in those problem shipments. And I'll talk about that in a minute. But the reason why we're shipping there is because their manufacturers have a need for this material. I just thought I would give some data on where, again, focusing on those biggest impact commodities or commodities that are impacted the greatest. You look at plastics and paper. You can see that when you look at the recovered fiber markets, China is certainly our most important market by far. We shipped, and I apologize, I didn't get a chance to update this table with 17 figures, but it's not too far off. We shipped over 14 million short tons of paper fiber to China in 2016, and our next biggest market was India at only 1.7 million tons. So China certainly has has a very large portion of that market. And then plastics. China takes about 67% of exports based on this past year, but it has been declining year over year. And I have the specific numbers similar as I do for paper. I'd be happy to share for anyone who wants it. I also wanted to share with you some information that would show the relationship of U.S. export market to the rest of the world. And I apologize for the ambulances and fire engines in the background. Let's let them pass. Okay. What this table is showing is who the other major exporters are of scrap commodities into the global market. And you can see Japan for plastics is also very significant. So is Germany, the UK. And as a matter of fact, when I was in Beijing last in December, one of the reasons why I was there is because the U.S. Embassy invited us to make a presentation to a coalition, an informal group of embassy folks that were interested in this issue and were concerned about the impact in their home countries. So we had a round table with representatives from the Japanese embassy, the New Zealand embassy, Australian, Canadian, UK, EU. Were all there to hear from us about why what was happening in China was a problem and how it was impacting recycling. And what was great to hear is that in these countries, these embassies were telling us that they were hearing from their recyclers as well, which again reinforces that the issue we're facing is truly a global issue. And it's important for us all to be working together. So not just within each of our countries with all the various stakeholders, but also across that country boundaries as well, because this is an issue that interests all of us. Okay, so let's now look at China specifically and what's happening and why is this all happening. I'm sure it's no surprise to anyone on this call that China is facing a severe environmental crisis. You see the pictures of the smog and the haze in Beijing, Shanghai, and other cities in the country. I just have some stats here I have found recently that 60% of the groundwater is unfit for human consumption. 19% of the arable land is contaminated with heavy metals. And there are so many more statistics. You just can Google this online and find a lot of these studies that have been done. But it's a huge issue in China. It's not just an issue of air pollution. And what's also happening at the same time over these last few years there's been rising social pressure within China, focused on the problems of pollution. I saw a stat in the last few days that showed that more than 50% of social incidents that have occurred in China over the last year or two that have caused the social instability in the country were related to concerns over pollution. And that's going to wake up the Chinese government. So if they're not concerned already, that's going to have an impact on them, because what the Chinese government is most interested in is keeping stability in the country. So now, why is this all happening? What has caused this huge crisis in China? Certainly, it's decades of putting the economic growth above the environment. It's also been lack of enforcement in existing environmental laws. Despite what people think, there are actually, and there have been for years, environmental laws in place in China that, if they were followed, would result in clean operations. But they weren't followed in many cases. Now, I will tell you that I've been traveling to China regularly since early 2000s, and I've been to some of the best recycling operations I've seen operating according to global standards, but I've also been to some pretty horrific ones. And so there is the full range there. And unfortunately, in the name of economic progress, the central government did not put an emphasis on cleaning up the environment and enforcing its laws. There was also lack of centralized control, because there was a premium for local economies placed on local government entities of their economic growth. And central government had great difficulty coming in and overriding that. Obviously, but the increase in urbanization has also contributed to this. There have been over 100 million new cars put on the road in the last 10 years alone. And you can imagine what that's done to smog and pollution. So all of these factors, and there are many more as well, that have contributed to this crisis that they're facing. Now, as a result, when President Xi came in, one of the priorities he put in place, and he said from the beginning, was going to be a beautiful China, and that's the phrase he uses. And so the environment, for the first time, was put on the agenda by the Chinese government as more important than economic progress. Certainly, economic progress is still important, and there are a number of other initiatives, including Made in China, I think it's 2025, and a number of other initiatives they have going on. But beautiful China is one of the top 3 priorities. And this means it doesn't matter if we turn to the Chinese government and say, you're going to lose millions of jobs because of one aspect of what you're doing with regard to the environment. That's not important. I mean, I shouldn't say it's not important. That is not the highest priority for them. It's not an issue. So what Xi has been doing the last several years is literally going sector by sector of the economy to clean it up and to increase and to focus on environmental protection. They've gone through most major manufacturing sectors by now, and this is not an issue that's specific to recycling. But over this past summer, is when he turned to recycling. Let me just say before I talk about this is just before I talk about the focus on recycling, this is just some interesting information that from the Party Congress of October, where Xi talks about, again, what his individual goals are for the different aspects of the environment. Okay, so let's talk about the recycling industry in particular and what China's doing. So, first of all, the first point I want to make is this is not new with regard to recycling. As I've mentioned before, there are environmental laws that have been long in place. And one of the initiatives that China took early on in the early 2000s, when there was the rapid rise in imports of scrap, was they put in place AQSIQ, which is the agency that was tasked with putting in place licensing requirements. put together an export and import licensing scheme. And actually, sorry, ambulance is going by again. ISRI worked actually very closely with AQSIQ in the development of those standards because there was a problem with people from all over the world taking advantage with what was perceived as an open market for containers of scrap going into China. And unfortunately, there were some unsavory characters that took advantage of that and shipped in a lot of waste material. And so this licensing scheme had the goal of shutting that down. And it's highly successful. The percentage of containerized shipments that contained waste versus scrap was dramatically reduced, well under 1%. I think it's well under 0.5% of total container shipments into China. So it was a very successful system. And actually, just as a side note, one of the, to our surprise, and not something we asked for, in the development of their import licensing requirements, they actually put in as one of the requirements for new licensees shipping into China that you needed to either have ISO 9000 or RIOS, which is ISRI's ISO type quality standard, in place in order to get a license. So again, we worked very closely with them, and we're really proud of what they did with regard to this export and import licensing scheme. And then things were relatively quiet until 2016, which is when Green Fence and the National Sword initiative started to come into play. Because especially with regard to plastics, and perhaps because of a strong economy, but there was a bit of laxity in terms of the quality of shipments coming into China. And this was actually an initiative we supported because we didn't want to see low-quality scrap work its way into China. And this is something that they're still continuing working on. In April was when Xi led a government reform task force looking at then specifically expanding the catalog of what was prohibited to be allowed in for import. And this was really the change that really started everything we've been dealing with. And why did this happen? Well, the common myth, I don't think it's a myth, I think it's probably true, is that around that time, or a little bit before that, Xi saw the documentary film Plastics China, which if you haven't seen it, it's definitely worth seeing. You can get it on Amazon Video. It is though blocked now in China. It is a documentary that documents the practices for a number of processing operations in China related to plastics. And again, it's horrific. You even see at one point there's a baby or a small child that is drinking out of a syringe that he picks up in a scrap pile. And it's certainly nothing that any of us condone, and we want to see those kinds of operations shut down as quickly as possible. But as you can imagine, when he saw that, that's not something he understandably tolerated, and therefore that initiated this discussion and these initiatives. The first impact on us was in July when the notifications were made to the WTO for the ban, as well as the new identification standard for solid waste and the carried waste standard, which is essentially a contamination threshold for what scrap is allowed into China. They also published a document, which I highly recommend anyone who's interested in learning more about what's happening in China that you read. It's actually on our website. It's only about 5 pages or so. It's their implementation plan to enhance solid waste import management system by prohibiting the entry of foreign waste. It's actually a very well-written memo from the Chinese central government as to their scheme of what's their overall strategy for dealing with the recycling issue, both domestically and internationally. And I'll talk about it more in a couple of minutes, but I want to make sure that everyone knows that exists. And again, it's on our website, and if you can't find it, I'd be happy to send it to you. The ban did take effect on January 1st, and that ban affects 24 categories of material, but most notably, it includes post-consumer plastics and mixed paper. Part of the problem is we don't know how those are defined by China. a different issue we'll talk about. And then in March 1st, so earlier this month, the carried waste standards went into effect. Let's talk about what's happening at the same time within China. At the same time that China was notifying the WTO of standards that it was placing on import of scrap, it also took a very aggressive a series of enforcement actions to recycling operations within the country. And those inspections found that 65% of the enterprises were non-compliant with existing environmental laws. Again, that's the problem of lack of enforcement and lack of compliance. As a result, those facilities that were deemed out of compliance had their permits revoked, or if they were, their permits were allowed to continue, it was usually with smaller quotas. As a result, there were obviously a lot of lost orders and problems with shipments that were coming in. And there have been a large number of enterprises that have closed as a result of this. Now, I will tell you, I don't list it here, but these inspections are continuing. I'm hearing from a lot of our counterparts around the world and in China that these inspection efforts are continuing, the enforcement actions are continuing. They are also continuing restricting quotas on import licenses. I just got an email yesterday from one of our counterparts in China representing the plastics industry, who tells me that the latest series of import licenses that were issued with the new quotas will result in a shortfall of over 7 million tons of plastic feedstock needed for manufacturing within China. So this is a huge issue, not just for us, but for manufacturers within the country. And that's why we're seeing some actually shifting of manufacturing out of China into other parts of Southeast China and even back here in the US. And then you've probably all heard about Blue Sky, which took effect this month and is supposed to go through December. That came out of their customs department, and it's focused on combating smuggling of what they call foreign garbage. There are actually gangs in China that the Chinese government has been trying to shut down for years that are smuggling in materials that are labeled scrap but really aren't. They're either waste or they could be other materials as well, and China's trying to do everything they can to shut that down, which we certainly support. Okay, so let's go back to the strategy, because again, I think this is what gives us the big picture of what's really happening with regard to recycling. What China is doing is they've got a 6-part strategy for dealing with recycling, both domestically and imported, all with the goal of cleaning up the environment, but also growing their own industry. There is a protectionist element to this too, which is important to recognize. And one of the reasons why, at least personally, I think it's so important to understand the context and how this all fits together is because if we're going to try to figure out how to address this over the long term, whether it's to work with the Chinese or also develop our own strategies here to strengthen the industry, we have to know where China's headed and what their thinking is and why they're taking certain actions. Otherwise, we can go in the wrong direction. So again, it's really important to understand the framework that China is operating under and their assumptions. So the first element of their 6-pronged strategy is, and this is their wording, it's to prohibit the import of solid waste with major environmental hazards and intense public reaction by the end of 2017. And that's really important. And this goes back to what I said at the beginning in terms of why this is all happening. Yes, they have a huge environmental crisis in China. There's no doubt about it. It needs to be cleaned up. But they also have a huge problem with social unrest. And that's definitely a factor in a lot of their decision making. And it was because of that Plastics China documentary that caused a lot of the backlash. And so plastics is first on the list for what they were going to target. And so they targeted post-consumer plastics, our verbiage, not theirs. I meant to pull up their language, but it's much different language, which causes part of the challenge in terms of figuring out what they mean by it. But basically, we believe it's anything coming out of the residential stream that has touched living organisms. So it's all the residential plastics, but also mixed paper. The second is But they specifically say they want to halt imports that can be replaced, again, their language, that can be replaced with domestic resources by the end of 2019. That's not an environmental issue. That's protectionism. What they're trying to do, and they stated very clearly in a lot of their other initiatives, they're trying to grow their own industry and not to compete with the rest of us in an open and fair market, but to do so with the support of and the subsidies of the Chinese government. And so if it means that to grow their own industry, they have to stop the open market, they will do that. Now, they haven't identified what's going to be in that category yet for the end of next year, but what we've heard is it's probably going to include some non-ferrous metal, what's referred to as Category 7 materials, and especially we believe insulated wires and motors are probably going to be in that category. The third is that they want to, and they intend to and already have started, to raise the thresholds for importation. And these are the carried waste standards. Originally proposed at 0.3%, they raised the threshold to 0.5%. A little helpful, not very though, for most imports. Ironically, for non-ferrous, they have it at 1%, what they're probably going to ban later. The fourth category is the greater enforcement, customs enforcement, and that's where Blue Sky and National Sword and those initiatives come up. And I'm going to mention this later too, but it's wrong for us to call what's happening in China National Sword. That's only one small element of what's happening in China. I'm not being arrested. There's a lot of activity though in the area these days. But anyway, so the National Sword is only one element out of 6 things that are happening in China related to recycling. So that's why when ISRI talks about what's happening in China, we refer to generally the restrictions that they're putting in place, and we don't refer to it as just a National Sword initiative. They're also, number 5, they're looking at refining their laws, their regulations, and related systems to tighten them. They're particularly focused on raising penalties for illegal smuggling, as well as decreasing the ports of entry for recyclables that may be coming in, because one of the big problems they have, and this is a problem for us too, and it's been a problem for years, is that because there's so little centralized control in China, that Beijing is unable to control what's happening in all the provinces, what happens is that the customs officials at the various ports have different standards for what they'll let in. And they won't all be necessarily consistent with what the national requirements are, which, although, you know, an unsavory character might take advantage of, the reality is it's not good for any of us, because we need to know what the laws are, and we need, in order to comply with them. And that's the message we consistently send in Beijing and in Washington, which is that we want to comply with the laws, we just need to know what they are, and we need to understand what the words mean, how to comply with them. And as a matter of fact, we've even offered the Chinese government that we'll help train their inspectors on the industry. We did that with AQSIQ back in 2005, there was a whole team of AQSIQ and customs inspectors that came to the U.S. and toured recycling facilities. They could understand the material they were going to be inspecting, and we've offered to do the same now, so they'll know what they're looking at and be able to properly enforce. Lastly, increased domestic recycling. Again, this goes back to the investments they're making in their own domestic recycling infrastructure in order to make sure they have the strategic assets to feed manufacturing, but again, to grow that industry. There are a number of misconceptions about what's happening in China that I just want to raise. What I was often asked, especially last summer, was whether or not this was retaliation against what the administration has been doing and threatening with regard to China. I can tell you categorically that's not the case. At least it wasn't until maybe 2 weeks ago. Where there was actually, now China's looking at retaliatory action against the 232s with aluminum scrap, but that's not definitive yet. But the reason why I can say that it's generally not a retaliatory action is because in my meetings with the Chinese over the last year or so in particular, they've been very clear that they are looking at this is part of the larger issue they're dealing with regard to their environmental crisis they're dealing with at home. And they are really struggling with how to define what is the material they want and what is the material they don't want. And they actually, at the beginning in the summer, they were really wanting to work with us to figure all of this out. And were asking us, how do we work with your government? Who do we talk to within your government? Because all they were getting back from the U.S. government at the time, the higher levels of the U.S. government, was a lot of very verbose, whatever language about the problems with the trade deficit, et cetera. And they were trying to work through that. The Chinese were, in order to deal with the scrap issue. So it's getting in the way of it, but it's not retaliatory action. Again, I already talked about how this is not National Sword. National Sword is a part of this, but this is not just National Sword. Third issue, again, it's what I just mentioned, the problem of we've got to make sure that we're very clear when we talk with the Chinese, what is a commodity and what is a waste material. No one wants to see waste moving into China. That's in no one's best interest. We don't want to do it. That's not the business we're in. We're in the business of preparing commodity grade materials for manufacturing, and we need to make sure that's clear. There is a problem in Chinese language with they don't really have a unique word for scrap or for recyclables, and we are working with them and have suggested some language that can be used in ways to differentiate material, but that's a lot of the problem of what we're dealing with. And then I would say that this fourth misconception is also really important, which is that the ban or the standards are going to somehow reverse China's pollution. I wish it was, but it's not. They have a huge domestic problem. And as I mentioned at the beginning, the import and export licenses, that scheme that was put in place by AQSIQ back in 2004 has had a very positive impact on the quality of material that's moving into China. And again, not to say that there aren't some bad shipments that have to be enforced against and shut down, but the vast majority of material that's coming in is very clean material. The problem is they've got to clean up their own operations within China. And we have delivered already to the Chinese embassy and to AQSIQ best practices and other resources. We're working with our counterparts in the recycling industry in China to offer training, safety information, environmental information, et cetera, so they can operate in a responsible manner. It's not clear how much of that will be taken, but that's something we keep on trying to offer. And we're willing to be in China providing these training courses just as we do here in the States. And again, we'll continue to offer that, and hopefully at one point they will take us up on that. So what are the biggest challenges we've got right now, all of us? Certainly meeting these strict quality standards, the 0.5%. The problem is that if you look at the global specifications for recyclables that are used, and I mentioned already they are globally used. I've spent a lot of time also in India. I was just there a couple times in the last few months, but most recently in January, meeting with the Commerce Department in India, the Indian Commerce Department. India actually has our specifications in their customs clearance process and their procedures, because in order for scrap to be allowed into India, it has to meet an ISRI specification grade. And so what we've been trying to advocate with the Chinese is that becomes a standard. And the standards within the specs can vary from 0% to 5% or a little bit higher, depending upon the grade and what manufacturers can take in their process. The problem with what the Chinese have done is it's flat across the board. And given current technology, it is incredibly hard, if not difficult, to meet those standards. And even, I would argue, more problematic is no one knows how to measure them. And so it's often based on a visual snapshot or how the customs officer is feeling that day when he inspects at the port of entry. And so this is a huge issue for us. Also, what is a carried waste? The definitions are very vague. Great, easy example, I'll use insulated copper wire. We were meeting with AQSIQ in December, and we were raising some of these issues, and we raised the issue of insulated copper wire, and we said, okay, you have a container of insulated copper wire, and there's some dirt at the bottom of the container. Is the dirt the carried waste, or is the plastic insulation around the copper wire, is that the carried waste? Because according to the specification grade, the insulated copper wire is both the copper and the plastic, because the plastic will be separated and recycled. And AQSIQ looked at us with a blank stare because they hadn't considered it. And that's part of this issue, is that President Xi has said, do this, do it now. MEP, which is their equivalent of US EPA, wrote these rules without any input from the global industry, and then handed it off to AQSIQ, which had no understanding of the issue. And AQSIQ has to implement something they don't understand, but they're told to do it. So they're going to do whatever they can do to implement it. And so again, that's why we've offered to try to help. And we've given a series of questions, sample materials where it's unclear what is the carried waste and how to measure it. And we've given a series of these questions to the U.S. Embassy, which has been trying to bring it over to AQSIQ and MEP. And I know a number of our colleagues around the world are trying to do the same thing, because and the message we're sending is we want answers to this so we can give that information to recyclers in our countries who can then make sure they're in compliance with the Chinese standard. I've already mentioned the problems with the inspection inconsistencies, and then the market competition. Again, I mentioned the protectionism. At one point, China's scrap generation rate is going to exceed what their domestic needs are. Not necessarily in the next year or two, but we've already seen it a little bit with ferrous scrap, and we're likely to see it with other materials as well, which will start then being imported into our country and other countries. And that's just something we need to think about, because one of the things we've heard from manufacturers in China is that the scrap generated in China is not as clean as scrap generated in the US and other countries. So there's a quality issue with the material coming out of China. And so that's something we're all going to have to pay attention to. OCC is a great example. China OCC is not nearly as clean. And again, there are other examples, but this is something we just have to be watching for in the long term. And I don't have to tell you the problems that everyone's having here in the States with stockpiling of material and diversion to landfills. So what's going to happen next? Certainly, as I've already mentioned, the environmental compliance inspections on the part of the Chinese is going to continue, which is a good thing. We're going to see lower numbers of licenses, import licenses, which is going to even put up more pressure on plastics and paper exports. And then we see a strong potential for additional bans in the next 2 years. We do see some market growth opportunities of other markets that are taking some of these commodity grade materials, especially in the Southeast Asia, but also in India, Mexico, Canada, the Netherlands. And we're also seeing some demand growth here in the U.S., which we want to do all we can to continue to strengthen. So what can we all do? Certainly, we have to focus on quality. And because successful recycling is dependent on quality. If a material doesn't meet a grade, if it's dirty, if it's contaminated, it can't be used as feedstock. So it's not truly a recyclable material. And so we need to all work together, all parts of the recycling chain, to see what we can do to not just make technological changes that will change perhaps processing of the material once it's in the stream, but also work on raising awareness within the general public and municipal programs, et cetera, about what can go into the bin and in what state it should be allowed into the bin. We're working with manufacturers, as we've been doing for years, on design for recycling, trying to increase demand for materials made out of recycled materials, or products made out of recycled materials, but also to encourage manufacturers that when they're designing products to consider end of life and the recyclability of that product. We're also, again, want to work with municipalities and educate the public about what can be recycled and design those collection systems so as to make sure that we're not mixing waste materials with recyclables and we're generating as clean a stream as possible. And we're obviously looking for any way we can to innovate and to change our processes and technology to increase the yield. And what's most important is we all work together. I don't think any single entity, whether it's ISRI or any other entity, is going to be able to solve this problem. We need to work together, share information, and make sure that we are, at the end of the chain, producing as high quality commodity product as we can. And with that in mind, I'll give one quick plug. This conversation, as I mentioned at the beginning, is certainly going to continue. It's going to continue just in the next 2 or 3 weeks. At ISRI's own convention, we're looking at 6,000 recyclers from around the world who are going to gather in Las Vegas the week of April 14th for the largest trade show in the world focused on scrap recycling. We have more than 50 different workshops and spotlights and sessions and networking opportunities for recyclers of all commodities. And we'd welcome your participation. We'd love to have you there. And so with that, I'm happy to answer any and all questions that anyone has.
Okay.
I think the floor.
Yes, thank you, Robin. Thank you for such a comprehensive presentation on the trade concerns with China and around the world. I remind everyone that if you would like to post a question, please use your control panel to type in the questions, and we'll go through as many as we can before conclusion of the webinar. So I'll also remind everyone that near the bottom of your control panel, there's a selection for handouts. And if you click on that, you can go to a link where you can download today's presentation. The presentation will also be made available within the next 2 weeks, including audio, at both the National Recycling Coalition website and the Pennsylvania Recycling Market Center website. So Robin, we have a question from the group that goes back to the beginning of your presentation, where you noted that about a third of the direct jobs are tied to exports. Did ISRI track at all how many of the indirect jobs are connected to exports, or was that not tracked?
That's a great question, and I don't know the answer offhand. Give me 1 minute, I'm going to pull the report. And actually, while I'm quickly looking it up, I would mention that the report is actually on our website also. If you look at, I think it may be isri.org/jobs or job study. If you look, there's a map, and you can actually pull it up by state, and also, I believe, by commodity. Yes, we do it by also jobs supported by the industry. I don't have that number in front of me, but we do have that number, and it should be on the website.
Okay, thank you very much. Robin, also, can you tell us, is ISRI as an organization working with the federal administration to not only look at international trade issues, but also future recycling infrastructure investment, so that we can in fact support both domestic trade and international trade?
Yes, absolutely. As a matter of fact, we recently released our 2018 advocacy agenda, and infrastructure is high on the list. We've been part of a coalition of entities that have been working and pushing the administration to really focus on infrastructure for a while, and more recently with the Recycling Partnership and others as well. We have been sending the message that in order that a successful recycling infrastructure is dependent upon a strong and healthy transportation infrastructure. And so we've been very involved in that debate, and we've also been encouraging the administration to include recycled mandates for any of the materials that are used in infrastructure projects. And I was at the White House last week talking with the person actually who is in charge of infrastructure development for the White House, and part of a large group, and I raised this specific issue about the importance and the dependence of the recycling infrastructure on a strong infrastructure, and our desire to be part of that discussion. And I'd love to say that he was very enthusiastic in his response. He was not, but that doesn't mean we're going to stop working on it. We're going to continue to really push. The Congress has been much more willing to talk about that and to talk about the role of recycling in the infrastructure bill than the administration has been, unfortunately, but we're going to continue to push.
Thank you. Thank you for that answer, and thank you for representing us at the White House last week. So I'll go to somebody else that points out not only is contamination an issue overseas, but certainly can be a concern domestically as well. And the attendee would like to ask if ISRI has any suggestions for or has been looking into issues surrounding glass contamination of fiber.
Yes, absolutely. That's been a huge issue for our paper division. And as a matter of fact, ISRI has, as part of our specifications guidelines, inbound material specs that also address glass. And so I'd highly suggest that folks take a look at that. We actually have a MRF summit coming up in August. We're partnering with SWANA at their conference, and we're going to be discussing a lot of these issues. And so, yes, this is very much of a priority for us and something that we've been trying to address.
Thank you. Another question, given that, you showed that China accepts quite a bit of our imports versus other countries, are any other countries, as you peel back this, onion, so to speak, in China, have you found that any other countries are also putting in place a structure to demand, essentially waste-free recycled, material? And if so, how aggressive are those pursuits, and what are the other countries?
That's a great question, and it's a good question for a number of reasons. It points to the importance of us using the right verbiage when we talk about what we all do. That we're talking about recyclables, we're not talking about waste, we're not talking about secondary waste or whatever phrases people use. And the reason why I say that is because all of the press and even the language that the Chinese themselves are using with trying to prevent foreign garbage from coming into their country has the potential to unfortunately create precedent in other countries as well. And the best example I can think of is India. We work very closely in India, as I've already mentioned, and with our counterparts there. And I've been spending a lot of time meeting with their various ministries, especially over the last year, to as they're looking to industrialize and they're increasing their scrap consumption. And I was there in October meeting with the steel industry, their steel ministry, and they have right now tariffs that basically increase the cost of imports into the country for scrap. And one of the things they were saying, this is in October. So we knew what was happening in China, but it wasn't generating as much press at the time. In October, India was saying, we're going to reduce these barriers to entry because we want the material. There's actually a move right now. The Indian government's looking at this. It should happen within the next couple of months. I came back in January, and all of a sudden they're saying, you know what? We don't want that foreign garbage either. Even though they're using the commercial grade specs, it's just the language that's being used is very detrimental to the health of our industry. And it's really important that we all are very careful so that we don't create this problem in other markets as well.
Thank you. Another question, Robin. I know you had commented a bit on the involvement of the Chinese government with, their philosophy of stimulating internal growth. But do you know if there's any indication that Chinese product manufacturers are able to also influence the Chinese government to allow in, if you will, the feedstock that they would need to stay in business competitively?
That's also a great question. The truth is, I don't know, and I don't think anyone outside of China knows, and this has been one of my frustrations when this first started over the summer. And we went in to meet with the U.S. Embassy in Beijing with a Chinese manufacturer, one of our members. And I thought at that point, we've got to get more of these guys on board. but they're not willing to come up. Because of the Chinese government and the influence it has within the country, we're not hearing manufacturers speak up. We're hearing a lot of fear, but we're not hearing them stepping up. That's not to say they're not, but we're not hearing it. And it's hard for us as outsiders to actually, it's not like the US, we can't go in and knock on their doors very easily and get them to speak up against their government.
Sure, that would be a concern. I'm quite certain in that type of governmental structure. Thank you for that answer, and we go to the next question. And if you can't comment, then let us know that as well. But do you have any opinion or thoughts on the strength of domestic paper mills versus the strength of paper mills in China? And are domestic mills perhaps at an advantage or lacking in anything, or would the Chinese mills be at advantage or lacking anything?
I'm a little confused by the question in terms of what's meant by strength. I mean, I think we've got some of the highest quality mills here in the U.S. Many of them are our members. And I'd certainly put them up against any other mill in any other part of the world. In terms of their market strength, that's not something I can comment on. It's more just I'm not familiar with all those market dynamics.
Okay, thank you. Looking again at the comments, one of our attendees commented that, again, given dynamics in China and other countries and the need for material, this certainly creates reason or opportunity to improve the quality of commodities and perhaps even for business growth here with tertiary facilities to do the same. Do you have any thoughts on that as well, Robin?
I do. It's great. I couldn't agree with it more. It's the quality issue is, I think, our biggest challenge. And, there's a lot of different stakeholders when it comes to the question over quality. And what a recycler can take may be different than what a municipality wants to have in its mix, because a municipality wants to achieve, understandably, a high recycling rate. But just because you collect it doesn't mean it can enter the stream and be successfully recycled. And so that's why the conversation becomes so important. And understandably also, manufacturers want to be as green as possible and say their materials are recyclable. In a vacuum, they may be recyclable, but does that mean they can actually work in today's infrastructure and make it through the stream? I don't know. And so every part of the infrastructure, the recycling infrastructure, we need to be talking to each other and be realistic about what should be in that stream, and then work together to improve it over time.
Agreed. Couldn't agree more. Thank you. And Robin, another attendee asks that you had referenced a Chinese plastics recycling documentary. Could you mention that again? And do you know if it potentially had an impact on the Chinese, trade restrictions?
Yeah, the name of the documentary is called Plastics China. It's available on Amazon Video. I have it on my phone, actually. It's a very powerful video, and it's most definitely had an impact. We were told that President Xi viewed the documentary. As a matter of fact, I was just watching yesterday or this morning a news story on CBC, and I think that was the channel, and they referenced Plastics China as well, and Xi's watching it. And because there's some horrific images in that video, and they were taken at real operations. And so they certainly have had an impact. It has had an impact.
Okay, thank you. We have another attendee asking if there is a plan B, so to speak. So if China does not relent and capacity may not be available at other Asian countries, is in fact there a plan B? And if so, any thoughts on that?
It's a great question. I'd love to know if anyone else has a plan B. It's in process. We're all trying to figure this out right now. It's an evolving problem. And as a matter of fact, at the front end of our convention in 2 weeks, we have the leaders of our plastics and paper division and MRF Council getting together with our Design for Recycling leaders and our RIOS board to talk about this very issue and what more should we be doing, and how should we be more aggressively getting in front of this. And I think it's also, there's no panacea. There isn't one solution out there that's going to solve the problem. I think there's a lot of little things we all need to be doing, and there's certainly more investment that we need to encourage here in the U.S. We need to do what we can to spur demand. And a number of entities probably on this call are working on that problem. We need to tackle the quality issue. There's a number of things, and we need to work with the Chinese and with other markets to show how important we take responsible recycling and that we're not shipping garbage. I'm not sure I answered the question other than to say, yes, we need to figure out our plan B and C and D and E.
Thank you. And I guess, as a companion question or questions to this, could you possibly highlight ISRI's involvements with product stewardship, and also you had presented towards the end of your presentation, ISRI's Design for Recycling initiative?
Sure. What we're doing on Design for Recycling is actually not new. We've had a DFR policy in place since before I joined ISRI. So since we were formed in '87, and at the beginning, it was really focused on working with the vehicle manufacturers and appliance manufacturers on design issues. And now the focus is shifting to more consumer goods. And so, but that conversation certainly needs to increase. We need to be more aggressive and work more closely than we even have been with manufacturers of consumer goods. And I know that, again, we're not the only ones in this space. There are a lot of other entities doing some really good work in the space, like APR and others, and we'll continue to hopefully work with them and to leverage each of our strengths to move these initiatives forward.
Okay, thank you. And we have an attendee asking also, do you think that it's an important time to diversify perhaps in your end markets of these focused materials in China? In other words, would you perhaps recommend or consider secondary markets for paper like insulation products or even composting?
I certainly can't recommend specific business practices other than to say that what I've certainly heard members talk about is the importance of diversification. And when this issue first really popped up over the summer, I still remember one of our members standing at one of our board meetings saying that, it would be naive to think that it's to focus only on one market or one product stream, that it's critical for the success of any company to diversify. So I would think, yes, diversification is important.
Okay, thank you, Robin. With that, I'm going to move towards wrapping up today. I want to give you a reminder that under the handout section of your control panel, today's presentation by Robin is available for download. The audio and presentation itself will be available at the NRC and Pennsylvania Recycling Market Center websites within the next 2 weeks. And equally, given today's quarterly markets development meeting by NRC, focused obviously on international markets, we do have a few upcoming domestic events that are, really at the heart of markets development. If you would have the opportunity professionally, brief advertisement and commercial out today for the ISRI 2018 Convention and Exposition, April 14 to 19 in Las Vegas, the April 3rd Northeast Recycling Council Market Development Workshop in Baltimore, and our organization, the National Recycling Coalition, on April 4th in Portland, Oregon for a regional markets development workshop. We really thank everyone for your attendance today. We had a strong audience of professionals, and we thank you again. We thank Robin for all of her knowledge today, and we adjourn. Thank you very much, and have a good day today.